Welcome. CFUW London presents research findings on intimate partner violence, presented by Balaji and Cyrus from the Addictions and Mental Health Program at Fanshawe College. We acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron people. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to society. We honor the relationship with all living things, including animals, plants, water, and the earth. This land acknowledgement is the first step towards reconciliation. Awareness means nothing without action. It's important that everyone takes the necessary steps towards decolonizing practices. We encourage everyone to be informed about the traditional lands, treaties, history, and cultures of the Indigenous people local to their region. CFUW London has been leading change in London for over 100 years through advocacy and awareness. We mentor Western and Fanshawe students to become advocates in our society. We donate more than $10,000 in London annually to Inova, the Public Library, United Way, and bursaries to both Western University and Fanshawe College. Thank you today for watching.
Good morning. I'm Mobalaji from Addiction and Mental Health, Fanshawe College, Ontario, London. I'm here to talk about domestic violence against intimate partners in Canada, the effect on families, children, and intergenerational. The abstracts. This study examines the prevalence, causes, patterns, and impact of intimate partners violence in Canada, focusing on women and other vulnerable groups, using a qualitative review of recent literature, government reports, and policy documents. The research highlights the IPF include physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, and technology-facilitated abuse, with coercive control as a key feature. Major contributing factors include gender inequality, childhood trauma, mental health challenges, substance misuse, housing insecurity, and structural inequities. The findings emphasize the need for trauma-informed, culturally responsive, survivor-centered strategies, along with stronger prevention, early intervention, research, and evidence-based policies. The introduction. Intimate partner, which is commonly referred to IPF as domestic violence, remain a significant public health, social, and human rights concern in Canada. IPF include physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, and financial abuse perpetrated by current or former intimate partner. Although individuals of all genders may experience IPF, women are disproportionately affected by severe and life-threatening forms of violence, representing 78% of police-reported IPF victims and nearly 80% of intimate partners homicide victims in Canada. That is according to Women and Gender Equity Canada, which 2024. Indigenous women experience particularly high rates of IPF due to interconnected effects of colonialism, intergenerational trauma, systemic racism, gender inequality, poverty, and cultural disruption. These experiences reflect broader pattern of structural violence, while social, political, economic, and institutional systems contribute to unequal exposure to harm. That's according to Gatong, 1969. Understanding IPF through a structural lens is essential for identifying root causes and developing effective, culturally responsive intervention. That is what an all 2024. Go to statement of the problem. Domestic and digital violence against married or single women in Canada remain under-researched, particularly regarding coercive control, technology facilitated abuse, and impact on children. Under-reporting due to fear, financial dependence, and systemic barriers limits understanding, highlighting the need for comprehensive research to strengthen prevention and intervention strategy. Then we will review some of the literature, which is empirical preview. Intimate partners remain a significant public health, social justice, and human rights issue here in Canada. It also includes physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, and financial technology facilitated based abuse. Although IPF affects all genders, research consistently demonstrates that women experience higher rates of severe, repeated, and life-threatening violence. Recent Canadian evidence indicates that IPF extends beyond individual relationships, affecting families, communities, healthcare systems, and social services. Contemporary research has shifted from viewing IPF as isolated act of violence toward understanding it as a pattern of behaviors rooted in power, control, and broader social inequalities. Coercive control has emerged as a central framework, emphasizing behaviors such as intimidation, financial restriction, social isolation, surveillance, and threats that undermine victims' autonomy and safety. That was according to Quarter 2021. This perspective highlights that abuse can have significant psychological consequences even without physical violence. Canadian studies recently identified gender inequality, colonialism, racism, poverty, housing insecurity, childhood exposure to violence, and mental health challenges as important contribution to IPF. Indigenous women experience disproportionately high rates of violence due to the ongoing impact of colonial systems, systemic discrimination, and intergenerational trauma. National Inquiry into Mixing and Murder Indigenous Women and Girls 2019. Trauma-informed research further emphasizes that survivors may experience long-term psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and difficulties accessing support services. That is what in 2025. The COVID-19 pandemic intensified IPF risk through increased isolation, economic stress, and reduced access to services, revealing gaps in existing support systems. What all 2025. Overall, current literature supports a multidimensional approach that addresses individual experiences while recognizing structural factors contributing to violence. Effective prevention and intervention strategies require culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and coordinated responses across healthcare, justice, and social services. Research gap. Current research on intimate partner violence in Canada reviews these gaps, including limited emphasis on prevention, early intervention, and healthy relationship education. Longitudinal studies are needed to understand violence across the life course. Underrepresented groups such as immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ plus individuals, older adults, and persons with disabilities require greater attention. More rigorous evaluation of intervention programs and deeper research on coercive control and technology facilitated abuse are essential to inform effective evidence-based policies and practices. Research methodology. Research methodology, these studies employ a qualitative desk-based research design using literature review and documentary analysis. Secondary data were collected from peer-reviewed journals from between 2020 and 2025. Government reports and institutional publication. Thematics analysis was used to identify recurring themes, trends, risk factors, and research gaps, providing evidence-based insight into intimate partner violence in Canada. The summary of the data. Summary of the data analysis. Data analysis indicates that intimate partner violence in Canada remains highly gendered, with women experiencing more severe and abuse than men. Sexual violence has increased significantly since 2014, while young women aged between 12 to 24 remain the most vulnerable group. Persistent underreporting limits accurate prevalence estimates, emphasizing the need for comprehensive prevention, improve reporting systems, and evidence-based intervention strategies. What are the recommendations? So the recommendations include: one, future research should prioritize longitudinal studies to understand the long-term impact of intimate partner violence and evaluate prevention strategies. Greater attention is needed on technology-facilitated abuse, coercive control, and the effective of intervention program. Research should include underrepresented groups such as immigrants, LGBT plus individuals, persons with disabilities, rural communities, and male survivors. 4, studies should also examine children's intergenerational experiences, survival resilience, and protective factors. 5, finally, evaluating trauma-informed, cultural responsive, indigenous-led intervention alongside public policies and legislative reforms will strengthen evidence-based practices, improve survival outcomes, and support more inclusive, effective responses to intimate violence in Canada. Conclusion. In concluding this aspect, domestic violence remains a major public health, human rights, and social justice concern in Canada. Intimate partner violence includes physical, psychological, sexual, emotional, financial, and technological facilitated abuse affecting individuals, families, and communities. Women, especially Indigenous women and marginalized groups, face higher risk due to gender inequality, colonialism, poverty trauma, and housing insecurity. Addressing IPF requires trauma-informed, cultural responsive, survivor center approach that address both individuals' needs and structural factors sustaining the violence. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So I will be discussing gender-based violence policies on social media platforms, advocacy, and platform accountability to neurodivergent victims. These presentations look at a growing problem. Gender-based violence is no longer confined to physical spaces. it is increasingly occurs through digital platform, and these harms can be especially difficult for neurodivergent individuals to identify, report, and recover from problems. My goal today is to show that current platform rules and institutional responses often fail to meet the needs of neurodivergent survivors. I will also argue that advocacy and policy reform must become more explicit, accessible, and neuro-affirming if we want safer digital environments. So here's a brief overview of where this presentation is going. I'll begin with background and policy context, including how gender-based violence in digital spaces fits with Canadian advocacy and equity work. Next, I'll define key terms so we are using a shared language. After that, I'll discuss the research gap, presenting Canadian statistics and policy issues, and then explain the systematic review logic that guided the analysis. Finally, I'll summarize what the evidence points toward and end with 4 actionable strategies for change together. This section moves from understanding the problem to identifying practical policy solutions. Before going further, I want to clarify some key terms used throughout this presentation. GBV stands for gender-based violence, while TFGBV refers to technology-facilitated gender-based violence, meaning abuse carried out, amplified, or enabled through digital tools and online platforms. I also use the term neurodivergent to describe people whose brains function differently from what is considered typical, and neuroaffirming to describe approaches that respect those differences rather than trying to normalize or fix them. 2 other important ideas are doxing, which is the public release of someone's private information without consent, and institutional system lag, which refers to institutions adapting too slowly to new realities. Platform accountability, meanwhile, means holding digital platforms answerable for the effects of their policies, system, and enforcement decision on users and communities. This slide situates that issue in a broader Canadian advocacy context. In Canada, advocacy organizations such as CFUW have linked gender-based violence prevention to human rights, safety, and equity. And this conversation increasingly include digital harm, not just offline violence. Campaigns such as the 16 Days of Activism help raise public awareness by showing that online abuse is not separate from real violence. Instead, digital violence can be persistent, public, and psychologically damaging, especially when it follows survivors across multiple platforms. Federal frameworks also started to recognize this reality, but while digital forms of gender-based violence are increasingly acknowledged at a policy level, the systems for prevention, response, and support still remains uneven and incomplete. This highlights the core research gap for the paper. Neurodivergent victims in digital environments remain under-examined in both policy and practice. The draft identifies several intersecting concerns, including communication differences, sensory overload, access barriers, stigma and exclusion, emotional dysregulation, and policy invisibility. These are not minor issues. They shape whether a person can recognize harm, navigate reporting system, and receive meaningful support. In other words, neurodivergent survivors may face the same digital abuse as others, but the experience and consequences can be compounded by the way systems are designed. If policies assume one standard communication style and one reporting style or one recovery pathway, they risk excluding the very people most in need of the protection. Here, I introduce three critical policy gaps in the current system. The first is the persistent psychological burden among survivors. Technology-facilitated gender-based violence can be ongoing, invasive, and difficult to escape, which means the mental health impact may be as severe as harm experienced in person. The second gap is inadequate institutional psychosocial support. Health, justice, and social service systems are still slowly to fully integrate the FGBV into assessment, treatment, and coordinated survivor care, especially in ways that are accessible and neuroaffirming. The third gap is limited assessment tools for technology-facilitated violence. Many GBV screening approaches still emphasize offline abuse, so they may miss harm such as doxing, image-based abuse, cyberstalking, or repeated platform-based intimidation. This slide presents Canadian data on the scale of gender digital harm. The figures shown in the graph indicate that a substantial proportion of women and gender-diverse people report experiencing digital harm with social media platforms being a major site of abuse. The slide also points to intersectional targeting. Certain groups such as younger women, indigenous women, bisexual women, and racialized women can face elevated levels of harassment, surveillance, and exclusion online. We suggest that gendered harm is shaped by overlapping social identities. What is especially important here is that the consequences are not limited to the moment of abuse. Survivors may reduce their online presence, self-censor, or disengage from advocacy, education, and public participation altogether. That makes digital violence not only a personal safety issue, but also a democratic and equity issue. These slides broaden the discussion by connecting digital harm to a larger landscape of gender-based violence. The statistics shown emphasizes that GBV is already highly prevalent and that some groups face disproportionate risk, including indigenous women, LGBTQ+, transgender people, and women with disabilities. The message here is that online violence does not happen in isolation. It often reflects and reproduces the same structural inequities that shape offline violence. Digital spaces can therefore magnify existing vulnerability rather than create a complete separate category of harm. This is important for policy because it means platform safety cannot be treated as a narrow technical. It must be understood as part of a broader system of prevention, right protection, and trauma-informed support. Rotating the three system gaps in a more practical and accessible format. First, there is a persistent psychological burden. TFGBV can create shame, fear, chronic stress, hypervigilance, and trauma symptoms because the abuse is often repetitive, visible, and difficult to shut off. Second, there is inadequate psychosocial support. Existing services in health, justice, and social care often do not consistently screen for digital abuse or connect survivors with coordinated support pathways that reflects neurodivergent needs. And third, there are limited assessment tools. If routine screening misses doxing, non-consensual image sharing, algorithmic amplification, or inaccessible reporting pathways, the survivor's harm remains partially invisible to the system. Explaining the logic behind the systematic review, the review design centers on the neurodivergent victims or otherwise vulnerable users experiencing technology facilitated gender-based violence in social media. The issue examined is not simply whether online abuse exists, but how policy, advocacy, platform accountability, and institutional response intersect together. The outcomes of intersect include policy change, enforcement mechanisms, reporting access, and mental health implications. The slide also identifies an evidence gap, which is policy documents rarely synthesize how advocacy translate into concrete platform rules, meaningful enforcement, or measurable outcomes for neurodivergent survivors. So part of this work is not just describing harm, but exposing what remains underdeveloped in the evidence base. At this stage, the evidence points towards three major conclusions. First, platform policies are often reactive rather than preventive. In other words, they tend to respond after the harm has occurred instead of building safer systems for the start through clearer standards, better design, and proactive moderation. Second, neurodivergent users faced compounded vulnerability, communication differences, stigma, sensory burden, and inaccessible reporting system can make it harder to recognize abuse, explain what happened, and complete the reporting process. Third, institutional systems still lag behind platform realities. Clinical screening, psychological care, and justice pathways often continue to treat digital violence as secondary, even though it can be central to a survivor's safety and well-being. This brings the presentation into policy and advocacy space by offering four actionable strategies. First, reporting must be made accessible. That means simpler forms, reduced sensory and cognitive burden, plain language, instruction, and more flexible ways for users to disclose harm. Second, neurodivergence should be named explicitly in platform policies and public gender-based violence strategies. If neurodivergent users remain invisible in policy language, their needs will likely remain invisible in practice. Third, TFGBV should be integrated into care system. Clinical, psychosocial, and justice services should be screened for digital abuse and create neuro-affirming response pathways rather than treating online harm as peripheral. Fourth, platform accountability must be strengthened. This includes transparent enforcement standards, clear escalation system, and public reporting on outcomes so that platforms are accountable not only for policy wording, but also for actual implementation and survivor safety. For the recommendation, federal and provincial health, justice, and social service systems should adopt a shared standard that explicitly recognizes technology-facilitated gender-based violence as a core category, with neurodivergent users named as a protected group. This standard would require routine screening for digital harm like doxing, non-consensual image sharing, and platform-based harassment in clinical, psychosocial, and victim services using accessible, plain language, sensory considerate tools, and major social media platforms operating in Canada would be asked through regulation or formal partnership to align the reporting flows and safety policies within the standard, including accessible reporting options and transparent data sharing. And then sharing about enforcement outcomes so institutional responses do not lag behind platform realities. The hub would function as a secure web-based and mobile interface where survivors can describe incidents once in a neuro-affirming way or the multiple communication modes, reduce sensory load, step-by-step guide questions, and then route that report simultaneously to relevant platforms and local support services like crisis lines, mental health services, and legal aid. Governance would involve a coalition of advocacy groups, for example, GBV organizations, disability and neurodiversity advocates, institutional partners, and platform representatives, ensuring tool remains grounded in living experiences and up-to-date policy. For future research, conduct a national and regional studies that estimate how often neurodivergent people experience the different forms of TFGBV, and then evaluate how existing platform and institutional reporting mechanism work or fail for neurodivergent user using usability studies, cognitive walkthrough, and participatory design methods, and then map the gaps in Canadian law around platform liability for TFGVV, especially for harm against neurodivergent and disabled users, and explore the use of human rights legislation for digital platform regulation. And then to investigate how survivor-led and disability justice advocacy influences platform policies, enforcement practices, and research access to platform data on online abuse, and to explore governance model where independent TFGBV agencies or multi-stakeholder bodies coordinate research, audits, transparency, reporting, and co-creation of safety standards with technology companies. So neurodivergent women and gender diverse people are at much higher risk of gender-based and intimate partner violence than general population. We cannot continue to talk about violence against women as if their experiences are optional or invisible. They are disproportionately victimized group whose realities fundamentally transform our understanding of gender-based violence. Policymakers, service providers, researchers, and advocates must explicitly include neurodivergent survivors in every GBV framework, funding, decision, and intervention design, and must adapt services to their communication styles. Anything less will continue to underestimate the true burden of violence and will quietly reproduce systemic inequities in who is protected, who is heard, and who gets the chance to recover. And these are my presentation for here. Thank you.
I would like to also thank Cyrus and Balaji for their research today, and also thank Fanshawe College for their partnership with CFUW London. And I'd also like to thank you, the watcher, and hope that this research and information will facilitate your own advocacy and awareness today.